Join me in the audio garden to cultivate our collective wisdom, nurture creativity, and spread love. My name is Martha Cinader. Welcome to Listen and Be Heard. I have a very special guest in this studio today, Meredith Leigh, and we are here once again to talk about resilient culture, alternatives to capitalism, and beyond. And welcome back, Meredith.
Thanks for having me.
What have you been up to since the last time you were around?
Let's see. Since the last time we talked, I have taken a full-time position with a nonprofit working on climate action, specifically with the higher education sector. And so I am stewarding a member engagement role for a group called Second Nature based out of Boston, still working here in Asheville. But it's been pretty interesting pivot from the food movement. In a lot of ways, it's the same, as I was saying to you earlier, it's some of the same issues. People working within complex political frameworks to try and transform the status quo and create positive change, and the obstacles they're facing and the need they have for each other. And I was really drawn to that work because I had gotten burnt out on the food movement, and I was ready to try to be useful in a different way.
Wow, that happens, I guess, to everyone, burnout.
Sure.
I so look up to you and Laura Lengnick as well, our local experts really here in Asheville, North Carolina, about the food movement, the climate resilience, the food ways, regional aspect of the whole idea of us each trying to do our own thing and also work together in a common way to solve some really important problems that we have.
Right.
So I'm looking forward to getting into this conversation. Before we start, and we are going to spend the whole hour, it's another one of our seasonal specials, talking about, we're going to continue the conversation I had with Laura Lengnick, this time with Meredith, getting deeper into alternatives to capitalism and the idea of the Commonwealth. So we will be right back after we hear Reluctant Warrior from the CD The Fire this time.
I'll be honest with you. I hate war in all its forms: physical, psychological, spiritual, emotional, environmental. I hate war. And I hate having to struggle. I honestly do, because I wish I had been born into a world where it was unnecessary. This context of struggle and being a warrior and being a struggler has been forced on me by oppression. Otherwise, I would be a sculptor or a gardener, a carpenter. I would be free to be so much more. I guess part of me, or part of who I am, and part of what I do is being a warrior, a reluctant warrior, a reluctant struggler, but I do it because I'm committed to life. We can't avoid it. We can't run away from it, because to do that is to be cowardice. To do that is to be subservient to devils, subservient to evil. And so that the only way to live on this planet with any human dignity at the moment is to struggle.
This is the Listen and Be Heard Hour for readers and writers. I'm Martha Cinader, and I'm joined in the studio by Meredith Leigh for our Spring Climate Resilience Special. And you were just saying, Meredith, that you got a little burnt out on the whole food movement.
Mm-hmm.
What happened?
Well, I think what I observed is as a consultant. So I've been, my book is the Ethical Meat Handbook. I started out as a farmer. I've been helping people who have been trying to decentralize the food system, and specifically meat, which is one of the most difficult, I think, foods to create equal access to good meat, right? And so I've been working with that population of farmers and ranchers and butchers and chefs and doing consulting. And what I've seen and witnessed is all over the world, people are doing, smallholder farmers, small scale business owners are doing incredible work to try to provide better goods and services in a more fair way to the Commonwealth. But because they're doing so inside of a system that is deeply flawed and imbalanced and coercive, that everyone's burning out, and that the movement is really burning through people, good people with lots of energy. And I started to ask myself why that was. What is the cost, right, of this story, right? That we can decentralize food and regionalize food. And, I came to the realization that I was potentially part of that machine of telling that story, that people could farm, or people could start butcher shops, or people could start restaurants and really create different scales of economy. When what I was actually observing is that as people were trying to do that, they were failing. And there wasn't an ethical way for me to consult them into scaling up or enterprising, because at the end of the day, the powerful coercive systems are continuing to be powerful and coercive, and we see wealth concentrating even further. And what I came to realize is that what's missing really is our ability to be relational with each other and to build a spiritual infrastructure that allows us to really subvert those systems. And so I became interested in cultivating my capacity to do that and to really become more of a facilitator in that realm of collective transformation. And so I've really been leaning into that recently. How can I build upon my knowledge instead of just creating structures and businesses? How do we create, truly common care, and what does it take to steward collective transformation that will really be impactful?
So we're like, I guess you're thinking of different people who were perhaps putting some of your thoughts and ideas into action from your books, and somehow seeing that some of them are failing, or knowing that there's like these forces that they just have not been able to overcome in order to do the things that they're dreaming of doing.
Yeah, financially, they were capitalizing, really difficult, risky endeavors.
Right.
And emotionally, they were, capitalizing really risky endeavors. So, I would get called in to consult with farmers, and they would bring me in and show me their balance sheet and ask me how they should enterprise and scale. And,
the alternative
they would
is
end up telling me that what was happening is their lives were falling apart. Their marriages were failing. They were deeply unhappy. They were deeply afraid for themselves.
They were burnt out.
Yeah, they were burnt out. And I would say, well, let's talk about that. Let's put aside the balance sheet, because there's no ethical way I can advise you to enterprise when what you really need to do is take care of yourself. And so I realized that, the people in the food movement who've written books, who are making money by and large, and I mean, I think Laura is an exception to this because she's been able to work on policy and she's been able to work on research, but a lot of the advocates, people who sit in my kind of shoes, if we're not being honest with ourselves, what we're really doing is perpetuating a story that burns through good and innovative, talented people and doesn't actually move the needle. It's maybe just providing better food to a select niche of wealthy individuals.
Right.
And that we've really got to start having a more uncomfortable conversation about what it's going to take to dismantle some of the status quo. So we are, in a sense, borrowing. We're all socialized towards capitalism, right?
Each of us individually.
We're the fish in the water who don't know that we're wet. And so when we talk about alternative movements, sometimes we're borrowing systems and structures that we claim to want to subvert. And we have to be honest with ourselves about that. And I think I got to a point of honesty with myself about that and said, okay, I've got to step out of this. I've got to also acknowledge that there are people doing grittier, more salient work, and I need to shut up and let their voices be louder than mine. And I need to become familiar with a different intimacy myself in order to truly be useful.
Let me try to distinguish a couple things here. One is that when you're referring to Laura, you meant Laura Lengnick, who's the author of Resilient Agriculture. And she actually had the opportunity to work for the USDA and do this very important report. And so when you say, that she had the opportunity to do that kind of work, I think that's what you're referring to.
Whereas and I think she has also listened to, because she's a scientist and because she's an academic, her audience is not always going to be the same audience as mine. Like, she has influence on people with power that I didn't have in my work in the food movement. My work was with
your audience?
My audience was by and large the very scrappy, for the most part, young farmer who, didn't necessarily have an inherited piece of land or a chunk of capital from some big time financial job that they had just left, and they were really, putting a lot on the line. They are. All these people are. And I don't want to... One of the reasons I haven't spoken very publicly about this pivot is because I don't want people to think that the things I wrote in my book I don't stand behind. I absolutely do. Right. I don't want people to think that I don't support the scrappy small-scale homesteaders and farmers.
By the way, is the Ethical Meat Handbook.
That's right.
By
I still think
Leigh.
It's absolutely necessary for people to be building those businesses and doing that work. I just want to figure out how to talk about it in a way that is really authentic to what I know, which I've learned from the land and the people and the animals that we've not got the most important part of the story out yet. And I think this conversation about alternatives to capitalism and kind of the way we are guilty of a systematized way of thinking that sometimes we're not aware of, and how we step out of that while still giving ourselves grace, I think is really at the crux of the conversations that we need to be having.
I think you're absolutely right. And, I had originally had Laura as a guest on the first show that I did here on WPVM. which is more than a year ago. And I just felt like that little segment I did with her was just not enough. And because her book was so in depth in so many ways, and really kind of pivoted the way I was thinking about taking care of the land that I'm taking care of. And we were talking a little before the show about how just that sentence is very fraught with difficulty. When I say the land I'm taking care of, I'm being very careful to not say my property, which I hold a title to, which is entirely based in capitalism. And so, and there's a bit of madness in all that, where we're trying to subvert, as you said, something that we're a part of. So how do we get into this conversation with people? It's very difficult. And even, I started out with a concept that I was a homesteader maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And the idea of being self-sufficient was not something that bothered me at the time. Like, that was a worthy goal, where now I feel more like we need to be communificient as a region.
Totally.
And so the idea of being a prepper out there just taking care of your own family is actually kind of reminiscent of these homesteaders who went and snatched the land from people who were there and who had not created a dust bowl, by the way.
That's right.
So how do we get into this? Like, is it absolutely... In a way, it involves madness and craziness. And we kind of have to embrace that, don't we?
Yeah, I think your vulnerability about, I stood here and then I realized this, is it's one essential thing. And my vulnerability about going, I was making money off of this, and I realized that I am maybe making money off the wrong thing. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think you have to be willing to change your mind, right? So I think that's one thing. And to hold dissonance, right? Like, there are things about capitalism that we just live in and are a part of. So any arguments against us sitting here talking about capitalism that start out with, well, you're sitting there benefiting from capitalism. Like, we know that. We recognize that. And it is possible to hold within your body and mind the dissonance of benefiting from capitalism and wanting to imagine an alternative. And it's possible to hold the dissonance of loving your country, but wanting to question the economic system that is its status quo, right?
Can we talk about that one point a little more? I always post these episodes that I do to various social media outlets, and Nextdoor is one of them. And I happen to have... be surrounded, I think, by a lot of people who, when they saw my title for the last special we did was Alternatives to Capitalism, they had kind of a knee-jerk reaction just to the title of that. And I think part of it feels like it's not patriotic to question capitalism. That right away people feel like, well, if there's alternative to capitalism, you must want to just overthrow America or something, which maybe a lot of people do. But so what is that in there that we can try to have conversations with people, or maybe sometimes we're beyond those conversations and we just have to be like, hey, we got to get beyond capitalism, just get with it.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, there's one thing I'll say is that we are in a particular place in our collective conversation and listening style that is not conducive to where we, to change, transformation, to imagination, to innovation, to co-creation. It's just dissonant right now. And I think sometimes it's easy to lose hope about that and to think that nothing's possible because of that. But I think it's also easy to think about it as a natural progression of a system, that all systems experience periods of organization and chaos. We see that in nature, right? And that we are of nature. And so perhaps there is a bit of chaos and violence and dissonance that is required to move consciousness, towards the next thing, towards a deeper thing, a thing that's needed. So I think I like to think about it from both sides, the positive side and the potential negative side. And I think, to the people who say that it's inherently unpatriotic to talk about alternatives to capitalism, I just think that they're wrong. I think that ultimately it is the definition of freedom to be able to question the status quo. And for people who claim that America is about freedom, then, you can't say that out of one side of your mouth and on the other side of your mouth say that you don't have the right to question or everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's built in, according to what I understand, to the framework of the country. And, I think that there's a lot of rhetoric right now, a lot of fear rhetoric that is pushing people into this belief space where if I argue, I'm in danger, or if I pursue, there's also a lot of fear rhetoric around the zero-sum game. If everyone has what they need, I must necessarily lose what I need. And I think that that's also inherently wrong. We've seen through examples of history, and we see through examples in nature that that's not true, that there is a possibility to create common wealth without it being a zero-sum game. And there's just a lot of fear, rhetoric, and dissonance.
To my thing about being having difficulty with saying my property, and the ways I'm searching now to try to create relationships with people that can sustain a regenerative type of effort on the property. I'm a 61-year-old woman. It's 6.5 acres. I cannot work all that land entirely by myself.
Yeah, that's really great.
And so the concepts I think that I'm grappling with are, I don't want to be in this like employer-employee kind of situation with people. Although, of course, there's times when I do pay for people's services and it's helpful. But what about this sort of idea of common use of the land? And this capitalist system gives me this title to the property.
Right.
But one thing that helps me with all that, gives me a little clarity, is to think of time. I think in Braiding Sweetgrass, she brings up the idea of 7 generations. And there's various cultures' ideas about, evolving, the next world is coming, or, the next generation of people. And when I think that I'm working on the land and it's not really so much, like I don't know who might so-called own the land 7 generations from now, but I can feel like what I'm doing now will have an impact that, after I'm gone, some of the features that I've managed to, like all the little beaver dams I'm creating and so on that have kind of changed the actual landscape, that some of that might persist, that the water table will be higher downstream for me because of some of my efforts.
Totally.
And
yeah,
so
you're thinking about being a good ancestor.
Exactly. That's
which is not something
me.
that is common in overculture or dominant culture. It's very common in indigenous thinking.
Right.
How to be a good ancestor.
Which is where I brought the idea from in that book, Braiding Sweetgrass.
Totally. And there's tons of ideas in indigenous thinking about how to share land in common, and plenty of examples of how that happens, and thinking about the commons as present day commons between people, thinking about the commons as relationships between land and spirit and people, thinking about the commons through time, as you suggested. And so, there's a paper that I sent you that I think you're going to link in the show notes.
Yes. By
an indigenous researcher, very compelling individual named Kyle White. And it's called Indigenous Science Fiction, fiction being in parentheses, Indigenous Science Fiction for the Anthropocene. And it's basically arguing that indigenous people, don't just talk about indigenous people as being people of the Holocene, that they are still here and still have incredible wisdom and have, in many ways, already seen apocalypse in so many ways. And what can we take from indigenous understandings of time and relationship with nature and relationship with spirit in order to inform our own journey through the Anthropocene, which many white bodies are calling the cataclysmic, apocalypse of the modern day. But yeah, one could argue that apocalypse happens all the time. I think it was Marion Woodman who elucidated that apocalypse just means unveiling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, that brings me to think about something else you sent me for people to refer to. And actually the video will be in the post. Is s2e12 begins her whole very interesting, powerful essay, talking about how death feeds the earth. And we need that fertility for new things to grow.
Totally.
So
I think most black people...
Let's go with that. We'll take a break, and we'll have station ID.
I think most black people see dialogue, or the request of white people for dialogue, as being basically analogous to stalling. Okay, stalling for time, like they say in the hostage dramas. I think what most black people would be, and hostage is not an appropriate term here. I think what most black people would like from white people is some kind of action. Now you can do it while you talk to us. You can say, I am reaching for my license. You can do that if you'd like, okay? Or you can just be quiet. But I think what most black people, what most people from the Seneca Nation, what most people from the Mohawk Nation would like is some activity. Massive amounts of it.
It is through action or non-action that we allow things to happen. We must put an end to the idea of allowing things to continue and not taking responsibility.
Tonaze, te chata.
To solve climate change if you buy a certain kind of cereal, a climate smart cereal, or really even any sort of a brand that's saying impossible meat or whatever.
Right.
Yeah, it's going to take more than consuming certain products to
that's sort of the elephant in the room, isn't it? I mean, when we look, it's more that we have to change the structure of how we live.
I think that's true. Yes, we do. And
as people together, and not just ourselves.
Yeah. And so that second action is just to say, in order to solve this, we're going to have to work together to change our behavior, not change our brand. Stop wasting food. That is based on so much research that suggests that one of the top 5 most cost-effective I think of these as win-win solutions. They're low cost and high impact. That stop wasting food is actually one of the top 5 things we can do to act on climate change.
This is Listen and Be Heard Radio, WLBH.org. This is the Listen and Be Heard Hour for readers and writers. My name is Martha Cinader, and I'm in the midst of a 1-hour special with Meredith Leigh, our spring climate resilience special. And before the break, we were talking about madness and various things. Let's keep going from there.
I think you were talking about, the concept of the Anthropocene and all the cultural references to the end of the world or cataclysm, and the indigenous writer Kyle White, who reminds us that indigenous folks have experienced many an apocalypse and what we have to learn from those knowledges, and also the way we think about what constitutes a cataclysm and what constitutes violence. So often we think, oh, every death is a violence, and or things that are truly a cataclysm on certain scales we don't think about at all, like when we step in the garden bed,
right,
or we shovel,
Any
into
movement,
the
it's a
fungal hyphae,
disturbance.
right? So everything we're doing, we're creating an impact.
Right.
Are we being a good ancestor to the best of our ability? But then also, like, do we have a realistic idea of what, cataclysm means, and how cataclysm is necessary for natural cycles?
And really, capitalism is cataclysm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Somewhere on the planet, there's always a cataclysm behind capitalism.
That's right.
And now, like always.
Yeah, I remember I listened to the last episode, and you were saying, does revolution always have to be violent? And I said, well, it's already violent. It's maybe not, apocalypse doesn't feel like it's touching all of us because of our relative privilege or permission to exist in specific spaces or in specific ways. But absolutely, all over the world, cataclysm is touching, taking people's lives from them and touching whole populations and cultures in terrible ways, and has been doing so since the advent of colonialism,
right?
Which is what capitalism came from, right?
It's been nonstop violence. And yet, but even when we talk about privilege, like, actually none of us have the privilege to avoid what's been happening with climate change. It's touching us everywhere.
That's right. And the question becomes, when will the apocalypse, as you define it, touch you?
Right.
And what are you willing to, how are you willing to change your mind, change your thinking, change your practice? Because what you practice ends up being how you live, right? In order to, become more imaginative and develop an alternative. And so I think, you mentioned Ismatu Gwendolyn, she's a kind of a blogger writer that I've been turned on to recently. And she shared a really powerful, piece about how revolution really does require death, that there is no revolution either of an economic system or of a way of thinking without something dying. And there is no transformation in the natural world without death. Life comes from death. New ideas come from death of old ideas, right?
And yet we don't honor death either with capitalism, which I think is part of our problem, like something else we need to step back to our indigenous roots to learn about again. She refers to, I was really struck by, like really moved by the whole half hour that she speaks, and I do recommend that people go to the post for this episode 12 of season 2, and you will find the links in the video to it. But she was talking about the necessity of fertility, and so, but also to honor those people whose lives have been sacrificed, that we have to take that choice to choose how we're going to do that, and not leave that up to some other powers that be. Like, we are the power.
Oh, totally.
We are always the power, and each person has that power.
Yeah, and each person is connected to every other person and to every bit of land. I mean, that's the truth that both science and indigenous wisdom both are, have elucidated and are elucidating, that everything is connected, And so, yeah, the lives of the people who are dying, that's us dying. That's our energy dying. And witnessing that and bearing witness to it and honoring it, as you say, is a way of creating the consciousness, right, that we need in order to enact transformation, similar to the fact that when we realize that dissonance in conversation, that shutting people out because of their political affiliation, not seeing the human in people because of their particular political affiliation or what they value or what they feel is at stake, that's an energetic choice, that I think, as it happens on a large scale, is meant to show something different, And in my studies of collective transformation, I've recently, by a fellow local expert and just a really compelling person, Diana McCall. I'm not sure if you know her, but she turned me on to Theory U and the Presencing Institute out of MIT, and kind of one of the originators of that is a fellow named Otto Scharmer. He's a German American fellow, and he has this whole Theory U, Essentials of Theory U is a book that I've recommended for listeners. But he talks about the levels of conversation and the levels of listening that are just natural. If you observe people talking and observe people listening, what kinds of levels you'll observe. And it's very predictable. It's maybe not linear, but, the first level being downloading. You're either listening for what you already know, right? Or you're conversing around things that you all agree about. The next level being debate, where on the listening side, you're listening for the things that disprove what you know. And it could be really positive because you're trying to build on what you know, or it could be really negative because you just want to pick them out and fight about it, right? Which is kind of where we are on a societal level, and if in the conversation realm, that second level is really that debate realm where we're just arguing and we're picking on each other. And then you go down to the third level, and that's the empathy level. That's where I'm listening from your perspective, right? And I'm conversing, responding,
using your imagination to try to picture what I'm talking about.
You might experience, and then the fourth level is what I believe he calls generative conversation and listening, and that's where, from empathy, we actually listen and talk about what wants to emerge. And those are the kinds of conversations that you come out of feeling like a different person than the person who started the conversation, because something was created in that conversation that wasn't possible, without that conversation, and something was created within that group that isn't possible within that group. And I think that that's where we need to come to as a collective, is understanding that we're capable of something together that none of us are capable of alone. And we have to tap into our ability as humans to really feel into what wants to emerge and build it together.
And I get
that's
a real
transformation.
Sense of something emerging. And I don't know how much of it is that I've been at the center of producing this show, and I've been talking to so many authors, but I kind of get this sense that there's so many people right now writing about, talking about, understanding even how society is mirrored in their bodies, and the harms that have been done to previous generations in their bodies, and learning to understand how do we heal ourselves and society. I feel like people are really reaching towards that right now.
Yeah.
And we, even as we've progressed with this series, we started out talking about these lists of things that people can do, and it was all kind of about what you can do, what I can do, what we can do, these things we're going to do, this list, which are important.
They are important because sometimes doing the things on those lists is what then connects the head, the heart, and the hand to where you really begin to tap into that primal wisdom and that understanding and connection that really pulls you into the whole. So that's still important.
And I could give you an example of when I sometimes feel that excitement is I tend to watch a lot of YouTube videos when I'm cooking, like in the kitchen is when I watch TV. And I've watched all kinds of things that have really inspired me, from like these huge water projects that they're doing in India, where they're just digging these trenches, and thousands of women coming together to dig trenches so that the water can soak into the ground. Very simple technology, but that has a very powerful effect. Or I've watched people make fences with willow trees.
Absolutely.
And that's inspired me. And so I could give, hundreds of examples of these videos that at the time they inspire me, and I might take some. It's how I learned about analog beaver dams. And I go out there and I make beaver dams in the creek, Martha. And so on. And it's like, it's exciting.
Yeah, it is exciting.
It's exciting. And then I want to share all that with everybody else and be like, hey, I'm making beaver dams, and do you know why I'm making them? And
right.
And then and some people look like, well, why are you trying to stop the water? And I have to explain, no, I'm not trying to stop it. I'm slowing it down. I'm kind of moving it up the hill, trying to move it up the hill,
That's cool.
But so I think those are just examples of how we can, we don't know. It's like when you start the conversation, if you already know where it's going to go.
Right.
Then why even have the conversation?
Then you're on a certain level of listening and conversation that maybe, is necessary. All these levels are necessary, I should say.
Right.
So it's not that like one of them is better than another. They're all part of it. And I think that's one of the things that gives me hope. It's like I can from a 300,000 foot view, I can assess that society's kind of stuck in level 2 of debate and dissonance, but that's part of a larger process that if I claim to understand or know the outcome of, right, like I'm on the wrong wavelength, you know what I mean? Like there's something bigger at work that I'm a part of. How do I be a good ancestor? Even if I'm not out there building analog beaver dams, there's other ways I can be an activist towards transformative causes with my energy, with the way I hold and use power, with the way I share it with other people.
And even those change over time. Like, as you were saying that, because I think some of your previous work in the food movement was in that vein, like teaching people how to ferment and all these things that people come together to do in a common place, and the harvest, like we have to come together and do those things as well. And so, but what does this have to do with climate change? Like we talk about all these things and maybe people are scratching their head like, well, I thought this was about climate change.
Well, I think what it has to do with climate change, it kind of goes back to one of the things that Laura was saying. Climate change is a product of capitalism. It's a product of colonialism. It's a part of, supremacy culture, coercive power structures, right? Exploitation of land and people. And so what we're talking about is how to transform those structures, in lots of different ways, but first and foremost, by not just doing things and building structures that we borrow from old ways of thinking, right? That
can we solve any of these problems by spending money?
Oh, sure we can. I'm sure there's a role for money. There's a role for good money. And there's certainly a role for technology. There's a role for, you hear a lot of people right now talking about AI. And so there's a lot of like people on the fence of like, AI is going to be the end of the world. And then there's people like, AI is going to save the world. And then, and it's probably somewhere in between there. It just depends on, are we going to twist it up and spit it out in this overculture that is twisting up and spitting out all of us? Or are we going to forge some kind of emergent energy with artificial intelligence, using our capacity to sense what's emerging? That's the thing AI doesn't have. AI is able to tell us everything we already know.
Because it's what we fed it.
That's what we fed it, right? But like what our capacity is to sense into what isn't already known, right? What wants to emerge through the collective.
Which some people might call tapping into madness.
Oh, it's madness. It's there's a whole episode of there's a podcast called The Emerald that you might be familiar with. And if you're not, it's pretty interesting. It's about stories and trends through a mythic lens. So it's about animism and the power of myth. And there's a whole episode about how AI is sorcery. It is, madness and magic and a conjuring in a way that humans have created. And what are we going to do with it, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, to go back again to s2e12, Gwendolyn, she brought up the idea of madness as, and she's, we should say, you know, she's a health professional. She studied medicine. And so she was talking about, you know, madness as a definition, like a psychological definition.
Oh, yeah.
But all through time, you know, people having visions and hearing voices has not been considered madness.
Right.
It's been considered inspiration, or, you know, a prophet hears the voice of God. And she even brings up the abolitionist as an example.
Yeah, she also talks about the Haitian Revolution.
And the Haitian Revolution, yes, as, you know, not madness. And then you have to think of madness and anger being like closely, just the word madness is actually another definition of anger.
Totally.
And so we have this like justifiable anger that sometimes we do need to tap into, and sometimes it can be violent, and especially if you're defending your life.
Sure. And that
right?
the madness, if we talk about madness as something that is against standard thinking, which is how madness is basically classified. It's any
right.
kind of stigmatized thinking that goes wholly against the status quo. And we start to think about madness, not all madness certainly, but some forms of madness as truly sacred, right?
Right.
It's like almost access points for a new and imaginative way of getting ourselves out of this mess.
Right.
You know, I think that's what she's talking about. So the book she references in her whole post is How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind. Which is it's a book about Black creatives throughout history who have really had to push the envelope of their own safety and their own sense of what is sane and not sane in order to, really achieve and create things that have really moved the world.
We've been talking a lot about s2e12, Gwendolyn, but you did bring up some other resources, and maybe we could.
Of what else I haven't mentioned?
You mentioned Donut Economics by Kate Raworth.
Oh yeah, that might be a little bit more digestible for some listeners. So that's Kate Raworth is an economist, and she wrote a book about regenerative economics called Donut Economics, and it's really just about how we do circular economy and how we reimagine the flow of goods and services to really cultivate the commonwealth, and kind of within the limits of the planet's carrying capacity, how do we serve all universal common needs and values? And the book not only, talks about the principles and philosophy behind that, but also cites some really inspiring work that's going on and some fantastic examples of stuff going on even in the corporate world to spur that kind of innovation. So I think, some of the listeners might find that
I think we have
read.
to remember that there are like maybe staunch capitalists who are also, want to save the earth, like who are concerned about climate change.
I've worked with plenty of them.
So this idea of having these listening conversations that can reach towards something that none of us have imagined, I think is really important, and part of that idea of a commonwealth. Like on the flip side, if you're all alone with some of these ideas, or you feel like you're alone, and people come at you with the status quo acceptance of what's right and wrong, you can feel a little mad or very lonely. And so you need that at some point, that commonwealth of just moral support, maybe, to keep the good fight going. Yeah,
I think that's right. And I think also, I actually edited a book for a fellow who was in his book, his character, he identified as this, mad dog capitalist. But what I pointed out to him as he was so staunchly defending it is that really what he was doing the whole time was questioning it. And he eventually acquiesced and said, you know what, you're right. I am. I'm looking for alternatives to this, and I don't know that I've found any yet. And I think that's totally fair, for that to be where you're at. And also, I'm working in the climate action space. I'm working on carbon offset projects, and I'm working with amazing researchers who are partnering with indigenous communities, who are the indigenous communities themselves are saying, we want to tap into carbon offsets. We want to tap into this very capitalist concept in order to preserve our indigenous lands and our life plans. And so I think that just as I'm willing to sit here and talk about alternatives to capitalism, it doesn't mean completely overthrowing capitalism in every sense. Sometimes it means let's imagine capitalism in a different way. Is that possible? I don't know. But I think, part of being able to have those conversations.
Right. Well, even to break it down, to ask, well, what does capitalism actually mean? Like, does that mean coming up with capital? And in that sense, is it all bad if we, pool our resources and put capital into something? So it's not necessarily like that money is evil or money is the cause of all problems.
Well, I think you get,
or that
gets
it's
into,
even equated with capitalism.
Degrees of the argument, right?
Right.
Like capitalism is, as it stands, a way of like extreme exploitation of resources and land and people to amass wealth and, coercive power. The question I'm saying that a lot of capitalists ask is that inherent to capitalism, or is it just what people have done with it? I think some of those arguments are based in kind of ignore the fact that capitalism came out of colonialism.
Right. That it's tied in with white supremacy,
totally.
basically. And
so
it's hard to divorce them.
Yeah, you maybe can't do that.
And because it's part of that thinking, like, even it's part of our morality of what's good and bad and right and wrong and who we call savages and who's civilized is all tied in with the thought of capitalism somehow. So it's a big thing to try to detangle, or it's like throwing a pile of pickup sticks and trying to pull them out, and it's not really possible to avoid some kind of destruction and violence, which is happening anyway. So we have to, like, these conversations are about healing too.
About healing, about being a good ancestor. Certainly a lot of destruction and violence is happening. It's not just like run of the mill, the cost, right? Like it's absolutely horrifying, and so what
for humanity and for the planet.
So what kinds of cataclysm are we, really, what kinds of cataclysm are we perpetuating? Is it truly like what the kind of ancestor we want to be? And I think that's the kind of stuff that, for myself as a white woman, for all white folks, like white folks aren't acculturated to ask themselves what kind of ancestor they want to be, but we certainly should be, because if we had been asking ourselves what kind of ancestors, our forefathers wanted to be, well, they didn't have very good imagination about what kind of ancestor they wanted to be, right? So what kind of ancestor do I want to be?
Maybe they were just thinking about themselves.
Well, I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Well, we're almost at the end of our hour, unbelievably. This went by very quickly. I wonder, I want to give you an opportunity maybe to talk about something we didn't cover, or just bring up another point about any of this.
I don't know. In closing, I guess I would say, like, it's all really hard. It's all really hard, but it's also all really inspiring and hopeful to think about. And what I've discovered is, as I've taken apart my own, complicit behaviors with, capitalism, and still think about the ways that I participate, I just continue to find opportunities to rewire my mind and rewire my practices and grow as a person. And I think understanding that growing as a person allows us to, interact better with the larger community and become more transformative. Like, that's a hopeful thing,
And to see beyond ourselves, to have that concept of time and future generations. So I mean, because I know I get discouraged. Like sometimes just going to these big box stores is discouraging, or driving by all these lawns that are mowed down to, a quarter inch every week.
Right.
All these things that are really not good for our environment. And it can be discouraging, but so I try to take a long view that these things we're doing now are moving us toward change, and it may not happen in the timeline that we're looking for.
Yeah, I think we do have to continue challenging ourselves and asking, are we doing enough? And when do we need to, really, I don't know, go a little bit more mad,
right?
Together
Let's
to make
get
some
crazy
stuff happen.
and,
But I think also we need to hold the dissonance of like big change and big action is needed, but also like small actions to become more transformative and to become a better ancestor are also revolutionary. And just keeping that in mind, I think is the most hopeful way to step forward in finding alternatives to capitalism.
Well, that's encouraging, and I think people need to remember to have conversations like these where we're reaching towards something that we really don't know yet.
That's right.
I want to thank you for your time,
Thanks
Meredith
so much for having
Leigh.
me, Martha.
This has been our spring special on climate resilience. My name is Martha Cinader. The show is the Listen and Be Heard Hour for readers and writers. My associate producer is DJ Jeannie Hopper. Our contributors are Tony Robles. Editor is Jeremiah Cothran. And next week, we'll be bringing you interviews and more comments about banning books. And I hope that you will join us then. For all the resources that we mentioned today in this show, you can go to listenandbeheard.net. This was Season 2, Episode 12. You will find that post tomorrow with links to all the books, a video of Ismato Gwendolyn, and more. And also, you can hear a rebroadcast of this show on WLBH.org and as a podcast wherever you like to listen to podcasts. My name is once again Martha Cinader. The show is Listen and Be Heard, and I want to thank you for listening and the opportunity to be heard.
Living it, giving it, having it, taking it, moving it.